Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the second session of READance today. Um, so to start with, I just wanted to hear your thoughts on the chapter. Was there anything you found interesting or any broad takeaways? Maybe we're reading the second half of the first chapter of the Rasa Readers book. So I thought it was quite rich. It covered quite a variety of questions and of themes. So the first one was it was looking at the move of Rasa theory as a concept into some of the religious literature. Um, I thought that was quite interesting how it started off as a secular concept and then why it was taken, why it was deployed as a conceptual frame for, for the purpose of religious texts and use. I wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that or anything you found interesting.
That was actually one of my questions that I ended with the book itself, where it started as secular, but it ended up being um, protected by religion just because it had to for the time where uh, I guess colonialism was asking for why we were being secular instead of being religious at that point or something, because they clearly mention the Europeans' entry, which uh, as and I think that was what was on page 45 or 46 where I got to know that oh, religion was taking under poetry, and it just made me wonder as to why that would have happened. And before that, why that thought didn't even occur that religion and poetry and art need not be intertwined. Right now, anyway, we'll get into it. But the other thing that was interesting is through the ninth and the 10th and the 11th century, where they could freely think and organize and write art in whatever form, either performance or anything. But by the end of it, they just kept repeating their own thoughts, either because of the circumstances that they were in, maybe because Sanskrit was not the form of language that they were going into, or variety of reasons. But as to why uh, the reformers or the thinkers were not able to think anything new, or maybe that defines the time also as to where free thinking was not that common, or people were moving from thriving to surviving. That also was what came through in how they just kept repeating, and finally they said, okay, religion is taking over poetry and art, and that's how it's going to survive. So I think those were the few of the outcomes that I felt like it synchronizes, or it matches with how we see life getting into.
It's very interesting points that you've raised. I wonder if though we could also interpret that. So you're thinking about why around the 17th, 18th century, why there was that dip in scholarship and why they were either repeating these ideas or they'd moved away. I was also thinking of what the broader context would have been like. So was it just Rasa theory that they were, was that no longer the pivotal like, focus of interest? So maybe they were still contributing in other areas of scholarship, but just like today, when scholarship in any field, there's a lot of interest, there's surges of interest in it during a particular time, and then scholars move away to other subjects when they feel like they've explored that to the extent that they're interested in at that point. So I guess it's a question of how that's situated in the broader picture as well.
Something that really interested me is a particular question that he asks in page number 23. Who feels the rasa? I think we discussed a part of it in the previous session. That's a pretty interesting question, is what I felt like. Is it in the writing that where we feel the rasa, or is the particular character feeling the rasa? As in, as an artist, something that I started questioning based on what I read, like what we portray, whether is it an emotion or are we expanding on the rasa. That particular, he brings in a really good question. Even as a choreographer, we sometimes question, like, this is a pretty interesting question that I'd always like to ask myself in the future, like, which particular aspect of it is feeling the rasa. Something that actually struck my mind. I'd like to know your thoughts also on the same.
Fascinating metaphysical question there. So who's feeling the emotions? Are we seeing it as a property, as a formal property of the text, or are we going to go and analyze it in the sense, does it exist in the person viewing the work of art? Is it existing in the character itself? Or as he goes on to say, maybe between the two, maybe it's in both. I think he throws that up as an option as well. But yeah, I also found in that page really interesting when he says, he attributes this to Bhatta Lolita, and he says he sort of theologically re-envisioned who the character was when he was thinking about this in terms of religious work, so recasting this metaphor that had already, this discussion that had been happening in the secular conceptions of rasa theory into the religious form. So as everyone characters in this play, who is the actual character? So yeah.
It's also quite wonderful how he says it's the first time that religion came into play, and those reformers started questioning in the form of Bengali Vaishnavas, Rupa and Jiva, whose question was something that I pondered on for a while, where it's on page 23 as well. So this is a question that Rupa and Jiva question the secular poets as to why, after all, use the language of aesthetics to describe the devotee's relationship to God if that relationship were not aesthetic, to be conceived as a drama in and itself. So this tripped me up a lot. As so I guess what she was asking is, if bhakti is a rasa, and we know bhakti is a rasa, why use other triggers or forms to express it? Shouldn't that be a rasa in itself? If the aesthetics lies in the character emoting it, why borrow the language of art criticism to describe something spiritual? Should spirituality, it's a layered thinking as to how, or even shanti as a rasa. You can say, I have felt grace when I go to a temple, and everybody here will understand it. But if suddenly somebody who doesn't understand grace or bhakti or shanti says, what is it? What color is it? How, what did you know? Maybe peace comes close to grace. They're not the same. Only when it's self-explanatory would it make sense. If somebody who didn't know the word bhakti and you said, oh, I felt a lot of bhakti when I went to the temple, and he says, what is bhakti? It's only justifiable. So at that point, as a choreographer, as a dancer, or as a writer, uh, you're stuck because the other person, the character or the reader, does not know. In this regard, some of the previous writers fail because they said, "Oh, it's by the person reading it. The person doesn't understand the language. That's just a word for him." So I think that one question was something that in the later pages he answers it, but I'm curious as to what others think.
Like a very, very interesting question. And yeah, he goes about in later paragraphs trying to make sense of this, but for me, that was still a very open question. So, what role exactly did Rasa serve when it was taken into more religious context, and how much did it stick? So, was there an influence again into the more secular range of thoughts, or to what extent? Um, was the conceptual relationship, I think, between these two paradigms. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this?
Something similar to what Yashaswini said here. When we speak about bhakti, he also highlights something called as desire for God. Now, how desire can be considered as a rasa is a question that he asks. Desiring at what level? Because most of the naikas that we perform, they either want to be united with the God or something. So now that's completely lust. Now, how is this a rasa, or um, how is this apt for the idea of rasa? That is something that started questioning me while I was reading desire for God, because the moment we say God, we say bhakti, but there are multiple other layers to it. So again, I think very similar to what Yashaswini said. I mean, it's a very open-ended question. Yeah.
Wondered there if desire and if emotion is the right translation for rasa there, because in maybe where we're tripping up is also in how we interpret these concepts as such. And through my, I think, reading of the first chapter, I felt like emotion is definitely, at least in the modern or the way I would conceive of it, it seemed like a very loose fitting to experience the range of things and of ideas that we're considering as a part of rasa. It also says in the chat she found the idea of semblance of rasa that the article brought up, and that rasa contradicts ethical normativity and the set boundaries to what kinds of rasa are appropriate and inappropriate. Interesting. I think it's telling that these interpretations arose once rasa shifted from the internal to the external.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly where I found the answer as to how, as especially when I was considering this as Bengali Vaishnavas and Bhakti, and how they asked why should spirituality be explained, or how does aesthetics relate to spirituality, and how do you express it? And if you cannot express it using any other bhava, then can you call it a rasa, or should spirituality be a rasa? But anyway, so on how as an artist to show bhakti, we take the help of other rasas like joy or grief or karuna to express bhakti, but we can guide the viewer on how to experience something that we want them to experience, rather than just say, if I want to show I'm being blessed by Krishna as a dancer, I would say, I'm Krishna, I'm blessing you, and show karuna or love or something on my face. But if I just say Krishna is blessing me and I want the viewer to know, it's going to be a very different experience. It's going to be very difficult for me to show bhakti uh, as a rasa. I have to take help of some other rasa, uh, is what I thought. And that is again explained, I think, on page number 26, where I think this is also the underlying, at least what I thought was the underlying thought process of the author itself, where he talks about internal and external frameworks. So, and I think he's influenced maybe by Michael Dufresne, where his quotes are saying that it is for this reason that we have been led to say that the effective is in the work itself, as well as in the spectator with whom the work resonates. Feeling is as deeply embedded in the object as it is in the subject, and the spectator experiences feeling because the affective quality belongs to the subject. And this was very, very important for me, because it was, the chef is has a taste that he wants the person to taste. But if But if there's no differentiation as to what, if it's the experience of the person who's tasting it or the chef who wants it to taste a certain way, will you be able to differentiate something like this? Suppose the dish itself should have a quality for the other person to interpret it in their way, isn't it?
Touching on the idea of taste again and why that is metaphorically applied. This tradition of thought. Yeah, I think I found that distinction quite interesting in what he says. Going back to both speaking about the differences in views internally as the tradition understood it, where only certain, or perhaps certain texts were not, or were no longer retained, and in the kind of understanding that in history that the tradition itself offers versus our reading of it today. And so I think that was a very interesting distinction. But I also wondered there if he could have maybe made more explicit, I guess he might in the later chapters, but also thinking about that in terms of the conceptual evolution. So we were told initially that there was definitely, so the idea of rasa is a property of the work developed first, and then it sort of moved to this dualistic conception. In the kind of, I wonder if though through the tradition and through the history that he's developing, if there was any movement back or forth between those views, or if it was fairly consistent as a lineage.
So one of the apologies if the point has already been brought out before because I was slightly late joining, but one of the questions that I had with respect to the same region that we're reading, page 26 towards the end, what his discussions come on to, right? If the discussions have sort of spoken about rasa as something that can belong to, the creator, writer, artist can reside in the receiver audience, or can be something that is a transaction between the two. The fundamental difference for me between it being something that resides in the reader or the receiver audience versus that of the artist is somewhere the work of the artist or the writer is a very isolated one, right? So even as an actor to that degree, or a dancer, if I have to be feeling, or the emotions or rasa resides in me, it is something that is very singularly experienced by me in that process, right? But the moment you transfer it onto a reader or a receiver, even in the case of literature, which needs to be read and not seen, it fundamentally becomes an interaction between the receiver and a work. And through that work, somewhere the mind of the writer or whatever it is. So somewhere for me, the formalness of the definition of rasa, whatever, seems to break down a little bit when you keep bringing it back to that of the creator. Because I don't know, I'm just saying this very loosely, but it's also almost like a sense of like a validation of that experience, right? Because what differentiates that boundary between everything depends on me, because even those formal elements, as mentioned, that the constituent elements as mentioned in the text, if there is nobody watching it or reading it, I can claim anything to be that experience, isn't it? Like somewhere I'm missing a little piece of that argument there for me to be convinced that purely the creator or the writer himself, herself, could be that, whatever the subject experiencing the rasa. Does that make sense? Like it's something that is still not piecing together in my head for me. If anyone had any thoughts on that.
So he actually mentions that. He says it cannot be. Resembles the taste it metaphorically references, which may be regarded as existing at once in the food, the taster, and the act of tasting, but it cannot be disaggregated or distinguished. It's on page 26. I think the one before he quotes Mike Dufresne. So I think this is something that I struggle with as well, where he's saying it's the food, the taster, as well as the tasting. And the tasting will only happen if the food has a certain quality, and the quality is being experienced by the taster according to their perception. And you can't really distinguish between the three elements because they're all in a flow. But the food itself should have a quality, and the taster itself should have a relationship or experience about what it is. So that transaction could be complete in the tasting, but it's also a flavor of both that is being perceived by the taster.
It's interesting because the view would seem, I think for many of us, that would seem like a very logical sort of following, but he seems to say that that isn't the case, and that he says later in that chapter that the comprehensive view in is how we would think of it in Western aesthetics itself was one that Indian thinkers themselves never developed. Um, in the last paragraph there, and he says here, theoretically, rasa could be regarded as a property of the text object, capacity of the reader subject, and also as a transaction between the two. In that reading, it seems like he's not actually involving the creator itself there. It's just the formal, it's either in the formal properties of the object itself, or in the reader, or is a relationship between the two in that reading. I think that also follows from perhaps a metaphysical sort of trying to understand, so is what is art, or is it separate from something that can be perceived? More broadly within metaphysics, there are views that would say the external world exists as it is, they're physical properties of the world, and others that would say unless you mentally perceive it or you engage with it, the world as such doesn't exist. So the representations in your mind as such, anything that you think of or can know as a part of the external world is more of a mental representation, if anything. So I guess that's kind of where they're drawing at. I think this also brings or highlights another question of how objective something is as an artwork. So is that something we can, it would seem like the rasa theory to the Indian theorists was a very objective, or could be analyzed with a very objective approach. So they were not thinking about is rasa something that's subjective in perception to individual people as they view the art, but they thought it's rooted in a more formal sense, the properties of the object itself, so it would invoke a sort of similar reaction as such in anyone who is viewing it or experiencing it.
Yeah, I don't know. I was just like, these are very interesting questions. For me, around this portion of the work is like, I feel everything is coming together because I think, uh, I mean, again, it's very difficult for me to also kind of translate into what is concrete here, but it looks like rasa is something that a priori as an essence is present. Like why do we define a bottle? Like it has an essential quality of being a bottle. So that's there. And then the performer or the writer is experiencing it. That's one. Like there's the essence, then one is experience and one is translating, and together it is all coming together. I think that is what's being communicated. I mean, but to kind of visualize what the essence is without somebody experience and communicating is yes, where I was also like, how would it look like in a performance, in a text? Like concretely, how do you translate that? So that's something I was also thinking along.
The other section that I found very interesting, intriguing rather, was just going on to the next page, page 27, where the sort of relationship between the idea of aesthetics and rasa and how it relates to sort of society, right? Which makes it then a very time-dependent sort of a concept, which is very, very intriguing to me because, of course, I mean, I like that he goes on to explain that sort of with a lot of examples as well, so you can sort of get an understanding of it. But yeah, on page 27, it says, the treatise itself, I think this probably was in reference to the Natyashastra, if I'm right. I'm just going back to it. Yeah, I think that was the Natyashastra. Itself institutes the social aesthetics rigorously relating rasa and status, although rarely discussed in later theory. It is presupposed everywhere. Yeah, I found that very interesting. Because that means even the formal definition of rasa then somewhere has to break down with time, right? Because if the definition involves, like for instance, if there is a work of art at a particular time which is considered to fulfill, okay, something for, considered to evoke a certain rasa because it fulfills all the formal qualities, including that of what was defined to be socially appropriate or culturally appropriate at that time, then that definition itself. So I was still a little confused by that, because the more you're trying to get towards a formal definition of something, you're also trying to make this definition something that can survive time or doesn't have to be dependent on localized factors, right? Which includes, in this case, such a definition doesn't just demand a certain time period, but it's also then becoming very culturally specific in terms of, how at that same time someone may say in South India would have defined appropriateness versus someone, somewhere else in the region, right? So what was the drive behind that? And yeah, how do you then start to even talk about like commentaries that have come, like say hundreds of years later, about a text that existed, if they are somewhere banking also on these kind of localized factors, was a question that I still had.
I don't know. I mean, I feel just reflecting back on this entire trajectory of how the concept is coming along is I think it all makes this entire discussion so rich and so much more creative for performers and also creators to draw upon. I mean, I personally I don't know, that's an interesting take, like how to adapt or adopt a concept which has changed over the time and has been very amenable to local changes. Is that the question? Was that the question that Apurva you were referring to, or like maybe I'm just understood it differently?
Differentiating between two things, right? One is, of course, the consumption of art. So it makes sense to me when I think of it as a consumer of art, that many things about, just my cultural reference points, the way I've grown up, etc., influences even what I find tasteful or not, right? It's that part of it, I agree. But in terms of while earlier we were talking about those formal constituents, right? So more and more and more you're trying to talk and break down this idea of emotion or the creation of emotion into something that is a very formal process. And the moment you break it down into that formal process, you're trying to get it down to its bare bones, literally, right? But then there's one element of, social propriety seems to be the one abhorrent factor there, which becomes a very variable factor, whereas the other things may, sort of stand a longer test of time, right? Because it seemed like on one end, that's what they were trying to go. They were trying to go towards a very core, bare bones definition of what it is. But the moment you attached this very specifics of the the social propriety, because I understand if the mention was simply saying that it also has to be socially appropriate or culturally appropriate, that makes sense. But it seems like then they broke down the definition of each rasa and said this will not qualify and this will qualify, right? So in a sense that you're going to the core and also away from it the moment you make it. That's the sort of what was in my head.
No, that's right. Like that's a very interesting observation. No, that's right. There seems to be some portion of it's objective and some portion is very subjective. And like, yeah, that's true.
How much of, because it's a very, their conception of each emotion is very specific, because in the way he puts it into that particular social context, he does explain that it comes from them perhaps viewing artwork of the time and taking that as in literature of the time and sort of taking that as the template for their analysis. So that was their starting point, and that leads into perhaps the analysis they offer. But I just wondered, because he does talk about the period almost up until the 17th century where this is being debated, and he also says it's being done across geographies, across India and the region. So I wondered if he could have maybe been specific as to whether that changed across time and across geography. Was there a different, or did those conceptions change? In the analysis, he seems a bit more interested in the metaphysics of it itself, which could have been the interest of the people writing it. So maybe they didn't see that as an essential element. It was just maybe one of the factors that they took for granted in their analysis, or maybe there was a wider discussion that isn't entirely covered here. But I definitely found, so for instance, he translates Karuna, he's usually translated as compassion or pity. He says it's not only, it specifically applies to not only someone who must be lost forever, there must also be a beloved. The subject, the rasa, accordingly refers primarily to one's own sense, to the sense of one's own loss. By contrast, the tragic rasa arises when someone grieves for a person with whom one does not have a kinship bond. And it's a semblance of the tragic, and hence it is itself comic. So I guess maybe that's also where the idea of semblance comes in. So when something didn't entirely fit, and there was something close to this emotion but didn't entirely fit this initial categorization, then it maybe was attributed as a semblance of that, but not quite definition.
Yeah, there is definitely that whole argument is very nuanced, and because he explains that again with respect to Shringara as well somewhere, right? The erotic with the Amaru poems, where situationally it is something again that is very different, but it does definitely raise that question in me in terms of like as someone reading this poem, right? Again, what do they mean by you needed to feel the erotic rasa also becomes a very nuanced question then, because the subject matter in itself could qualify as something that belongs to the realm of love or relationships or romantic relationships. I'm just going to use English words so that we don't get into that place. But depending upon the story that is being said, what is the experience that you are evoking in the viewer, or what you want to evoke, also becomes a nuanced sort of a space. And are we also saying then that perhaps we are saying a bit of that, right? We are saying that what rasa you can evoke, or what experience you can evoke in a reader or a viewer, cannot be separated from, in many senses, the the life experiences they themselves have had. And I mean that loosely, but what is okay culturally, what is perceived culturally, what you see to a large extent around you. So you cannot actually separate that experience that a viewer is having, because if the subject matter is just inappropriate to you as someone watching, then what you take away from it is a very opposite kind of an experience. I don't know. It's still tricky in my head. I'm just trying to make sense of, is that what we're actually saying, right? Did anyone have a sense of, because I haven't looked at the references column at all yet, but because he uses the word semblance always in quotes, so I presume there is like a Sanskrit equivalent technical term for it. Did anyone manage to look that up or find out, like, what is that word in Sanskrit? Maybe he says it somewhere, but I wasn't. Abhasa?
Abhasa, yeah.
But that's the word but that is the word, is it? There is nothing else when he says semblance of a rasa. There's no other technical term that he's referring to.
Also, sorry, I can't turn on my video because I'm traveling and the network is pretty bad. I just wanted to point out here that when he says it also, uh, the spectator experiencing the feeling, and also about the social construct or the proprietary to be for it to be acceptable by society, whatever you're showing or whatever you're writing, it has to be acceptable by the society. uh, shouldn't it That is one thing, but also wouldn't it be individual experiences also, as in, like, for a person who doesn't um, for a person who a horror, let's take films for example. A horror film might not be something they enjoy. So if they are given that part of it, what kind of a rasa does a person feel? Because the others who enjoys that genre of films might feel a different rasa than the person who will not who's not interested in that. So it also depends on what your interest or what your taste is. how you feel a performance or how you view the performance also depends on what you are okay with and what you're not okay with. how can how can you define, how can you formalize that, right? Because it becomes individual now. Socially a horror film is accepted, but individually a person might not be um, they might not feel the rasa, even though that's the intention of the creator. uh, a person viewing, if they don't have the taste of watching a particular type, they might not feel exactly the same rasa. So when it comes to formalizing these, what are we considering and how does it work?
Uh, So, Panashri, somewhere later, I think page 34, I had marked a paragraph, a couple of paragraphs there where he addresses this very interesting idea of who has the capacity for to be a rasika, right? To experience a rasa. So somewhere it's very clear again that it is not so much of a, I think what my understanding is what we refer to as enjoying something is a question of preference more than a question of like experiencing the output of that art form, really, right? So and the way you if I don't prefer, I don't enjoy that kind of thing, that is actually something that comes, how do you say, it changes also the way you engage with that particular form and how much of an experience that you're allowing yourself to have also. I know that somewhere else that there are definitions for this as well. I remember a long time reading, I think some part of the Natyashastra also talks about the state of the mind of the Rasika. Like, how do you come into it, or how do you stay present in a thing? So, like, definitions
So
even
for
for,
you,
sorry, is my voice echoing? Oh,
yeah, it
okay.
kind of did.
I think this is very similar to what Yashaswini made a point about the chef cooking and the taster having a particular ideology of, or the quality of tasting as a taster. I think that's exactly what the reader is trying, I mean, the writer is trying to say here that I think that it was the same point that even you were saying too, ma'am, as you said here, like even you attend a couple of shows, you don't take anything back. I think, yeah, one, it is up to the creator how they do, and two, it's up to us how we take it as someone who qualifies to sit and watch and understand what the person is doing, whether the chef is cooking or whether the film is actually making some sense to us. I think if I got you right, is that what you were trying to say in your comment? Yeah, yeah.
No, so by
Okay.
that standard, can you truly formalize a rasa is what was going on in my mind. Isn't it? It depends on the experience of the viewer, depends on there are a lot of variables. So when you are formalizing something, how, I don't know, it's just a thought that's been there for quite a long time. Like, how do you say that what you felt is this or what you felt is just this, right?
Yes, I mean, that's exactly what we had discussed in the first few minutes as well. As to say that with this group, if I say I went to Arunachala and felt a lot of bhakti in the temple, I think all of people here would understand it. But maybe from some other culture, someone else may not realize what bhakti is. That might just be a word for him. So he might say, what does it mean? What is it that that you felt? What does bhakti mean? So for me, as a person experiencing it, it's complete and whole in itself. But when I'm trying to translate it onto paper in communication as an artist or as anything else, for bhakti and spirituality, and maybe love could be easier to communicate, or karuna, or despair, or grief. How would I do it? And I think that's one of the things where you feeling the emotion is complete in itself, but when you're trying to translate it through communication to someone else, especially with spirituality and bhakti, is the word, or shanti for that reason, is sitting in shantam, or I felt peaceful, give a sense of peace to the person reading it, or to the person, watching it? Or do you have to show it in other forms, to take other forms to show it? And should that person also be aware of what it means in that context with his circumstances to understand a, a translated part of, or perceive that emotion?
Maybe I have a small disagreement there, Yashasvi, with what you've said, because I'm not so. So the definition of also trying to distill what the most basic emotions were, right? What are the, so to say, fundamental emotions? My understanding is came out of that space to see what are those things that we have a capacity to feel, irrespective of our social situation or our experiences in life, so on and so forth, right? And so therefore the argument of something like, vatsalya, is it fundamental, is it not fundamental? Because it's an interesting question to ask. In the absence of that kind of a relationship itself, do I have the capacity to feel an emotion, right? Versus something like happy and sad and disgust, or so on and so forth. So I think it has to boil down to that fundamentally, right? Because even with devotion or whatever, bhakti, feeling bhakti in front of a particular deity becomes a very culturally specific thing. But I think the question to be asked is, do we have a capacity for bhakti as a species, or is it a construct of human society? Right? Is it something that, is instinctively built into you, or it is something that we have developed? What is very, very interesting is that something that I would have never thought of, he also makes that statement about karuna, meaning compassion, as something that, only whatever became like a common emotion of being able to feel compassion, when you're not attached to creatures, as something that was brought in only as an idea, through Buddhism. So I think maybe that is what needs to be considered in terms of whether, something, an experience, is transferable or not. I may not feel it for the object that you are feeling it for, right? But can there be a
Can you
kind of
translate that emotion to, and how would you translate? If I have, and this was a question that was asked, I mean, I think it was prior to you joining, but this is what I had to think about, because this was questioned by Rupa and Jiva Goswami while debating as Vaishnavas, where he says, why after all use the language of aesthetics to describe the devotee's relationship to God, if that relationship were not aesthetic, to be conceived as a drama in and of itself? So I think what they're saying is bhakti as an emotion is complete by itself. Why use the form of aesthetics to maybe relate it? But that's what I'm saying. If I have to show bhakti or devotion or spirituality And if I can say that, it's okay. But when I'm writing it, if I want my reader or my viewer or the person receiving it to feel bhakti, how would I do it? How would I show it? I think that was the question. The communication, the translation of how that would go to the receiver and viewer, what would happen there? Does bhakti by itself can be translated as this, or would it need other forms of rasas to support it?
I just wanted to add something here, just along the same line. Like, what bhakti means to you need not be the same thing to the other person, to another person, right? Bhakti is very personal, I feel. I don't know. So when you say bhakti, for you it might be love, for someone else it might be something else. Correct, right? So, and the extent of the experience or the of that bhakti feeling that you feel is also different. But what it means to you um, might not be the same thing that the other person also feels. It might be different to them. So when you are I think when you say that, how do I translate this, and I feel bhakti is very personal to each person. So uh, it can only be you as a person, what do you feel? It can only be translated in that level. Now, reading that, what the other person feels is entirely um, it's questionable, right? They need not feel the same thing that you felt.
But how would you translate it? How would you tell the person that your bhakti towards a cow is different towards from a I am resounding. Okay. Towards a cow could be different from a bhakti towards a deity, or even that brings into question, well, this is completely different, but of how you are faithful or religious to a deity or to scriptures. But all of that made me think about that experience of you as what, going back to something that's very familiar, or to say, you could make food devotional. From your point of view, that food could be made with a lot of devotion. But if you want the person who's tasting it to feel their perception of devotion to it, how would you make them feel it versus your perception of how would you.
Yashasvi, I don't know if I am understanding this wrong, but definitely I think my understanding is slightly different from yours, in the sense that the subject matter is supposed to evoke a feeling, but not necessarily a feeling towards it. So I think when you say, okay, if I show bhakti towards Shiva, my audience will feel bhakti towards Shiva, is not the way I have understood it, right? Through using Shiva as a subject matter and fulfilling all the formal ways of evoking this emotion, I am supposed to trigger that emotion in the audience, right? But not towards this subject matter, right? And there was something earlier on also about, which made it necessary, where he makes that distinction between looking at these heroes and heroines as who they are, like Rama, and is Rama's love Rama's love, or is there something about even the way you think of them, the moment they become characters in a dramatic play, that they have to occupy a more generalized space, so to say, right? So
That becomes very subjective. Exactly, that becomes very subjective, because then you don't know Ram. I mean, through characters and through plays, through books. So when I'm thinking of Rama or Sita or portraying that, it becomes a very my personal experience of who I am or what I've seen comes into play, rather than or your context of the dharma of the time comes into play, and our experiences come into play, right? Am I audible?
Go back to what he said about transubstantiation that he invoked last time. The idea that there is a commonality, so maybe the subject that you're experiencing or the theme that you're showing changes, but then everyone takes away from that as rasa, whether it's in the artwork or in the person who's watching it. There seems to be an argument that they share a sense of a commonality of experience. Maybe you're looking at something that you're watching a comedy and you laugh. In our laughter, we all share a similar sense of experience, but they may be different things that provoke laughter in each of us or that we find humorous. So the idea for me was that changes over time, but then when we experience humor from an artwork, we're all sharing the same aesthetic experience, and so on for each of the rasas. That within Western philosophy and phenomenology, for instance, that remains debated. So the question is, can you really reduce something to an objective analysis, or is the way we experience these things different? It remains sort of an open question. But I wonder also whether this was ever raised within the text, because he doesn't seem to indicate this. He seems to be taking that they all, at least the Rasa theorists, they all had this shared framework. They were accepting that this was possible, that you could analyze this objectively, and that there was some sense of a shared experience there.
Yeah, just sort of just what I typed in the comment only. So whether there is a distinction between emotions and what's considered as fundamental and transferable emotions between these two ideas, right? Because that mention of karuna itself, compassion rather, karuna, the way we understand it as compassion itself, not necessarily being in the thought process of thinkers before Buddhism became prominent, is a very interesting one, because I also simply think of it from a point of view of, like, for instance, vegetarianism, right? It's an active choice that is made by human beings. We've not evolved to be vegetarians at all. But then it's a whole intellectual discourse that brings you to that place. Of course, it is supported by, when we say compassion towards whatever living beings, but we're also we've not evolved to be that, right? So when there is somebody who does not, who is very comfortable with eating meat, it is not you can't turn around and accusing them of not having compassion. That's not the equivalent of it. So somewhere, can there be like a distinction of the fundamental versus, something of like derived emotions or derived rasas based on what is it that we are hardwired to feel versus, what we sort of teach ourselves to feel. I don't know if that even is a right question to ask, but that's been in my mind.
I have few things to share. Like when you said about rasa, as a dancer, we think about when you say love, that Shringara love when you're expressing as a dance thing, we have a stimulant, a catalyst, which we transfer, we keep it in our mind. Even in the Sangam literature, the poem what we read, in this, the erotic manner, they don't make it as a vulgar thing. They make it in a very thing, they use lots of like flowers. So to make it very meaningful and make it pleasing for us to convey. For example, the jasmine, the flower has an essence that the fragrance has been transferred to the audience through the emotions of love. So that, as Yashashwini mentioned about the taste, is already there in the text about the taste, the tasting, the taster. So there is a difference. Similarly, the dancer would emote it. So we use it as a aharya abhinya, and the flowers as a decor for the audience, which will structure our face to the audience so that we can express our ideas, that is, it's visible to the audience. Similarly, the fragrance of the jasmine, it's not only the thing, it's mentioned mostly as a flower. So even the land, the geographical land has been divided into Kurunji, Mullai, Neidal. So these are the, with flowers, they compare with flowers. That the fragrance has a very, very important sensual thing, which has been transferred as an aesthetics thing. So the rasa has been transferred, the dancer to the audience. The catalyst will be the flowers, the smell, the fragrance. So that one aspect I'm talking about. So similarly, there are a lot of other aspects which will influence to transfer and carry on. So this is my thought process.
Thank you for sharing that. Does anyone else have any other concluding remarks or anything else you'd like to bring up or raise today?